Hello and welcome to my channel where we talk about all things attachment styles and no contact. Today, I'm going to be talking about why dismissive avoidants pull away. First off, it's really important to remember that attachment styles exist on a spectrum. Someone may have more severe avoidant attachment due to deep core wounds associated with their attachment trauma, but some other avoidants may just have issues with conflict when it comes up, and they don't necessarily have issues with intimacy or deepening relationships. So it's really important to consider that no two avoidants are going to be the exact same in a relationship. Now, one of the first reasons avoidants will pull away in relationships is because of a fear of intimacy. Now, this doesn't necessarily apply to all avoidants. I'll definitely cover that. But one of the most common reasons that someone with maybe a bit more of a severe avoidant attachment style will pull away is because intimacy can be quite triggering for them. Speaking from my own personal experience, when I was considered maybe an unhealed fearful avoidant, I didn't really necessarily have issues with intimacy in relationships. I didn't necessarily fear them. My anxious side kind of actually helped me embrace intimacy a little bit more, but for people who may be more purely dismissive avoidant, where they don't really have much of an anxious attachment style associated with theirs, these fears of intimacy can be very motivating for them to the point where they pull away or withdraw from relationships, sometimes suddenly, because they don't want to necessarily get hurt again. They don't necessarily want to be seen as a failure if they're not able to live up to the other person's expectations. They often have wounds associated with not being good enough, not deserving love, or not having room to be their own person within a relationship or a connection because they've been kind of nurtured to show up in a certain way for other people. Which leads me into the second reason as to why dismissive avoidants often pull away. It is because of past trauma or perhaps a rejection wound anytime they tried to speak up for themselves, anytime they tried to share their dreams or their hopes or perhaps their ambitions and they were rejected or shamed or ridiculed. And this is why many dismissive avoidants have a core wound associated with not being good enough. But it's also why many dismissive avoidants can come on very strong in the relationship. They're often trying to pursue a wound in themselves that they're trying to heal, because if they can convince people that they are worthy of love, then they can convince themselves that they deserve love. But as that relationship deepens, as that intimacy grows, the challenge between that belief system that they've adopted out of self-protection becomes severely challenged. Through the course of how they show up in the relationship, it creates conflict, which only reinforces the belief that they're not good enough because they can't keep someone happy. And rather than being at the end of receiving a breakup, they're the ones who do the breaking up first. And that is often why they will pull away first if the rejection wound is very strong in their relationship and within themselves. To get ahead of this rejection trauma, they will be the ones many times to do the breaking up first. And that is why many times they'll pull away because of this rejection wound. The third reason you commonly see for dismissive avoidance pulling away is usually associated with their need for independence. Now, you'll commonly see other videos online that say, dismissive avoidants love their independence. They love to be alone. They are chronically single people, and this isn't always the case. For myself, personally speaking, when I was leaning more dismissive avoidant as a fearful avoidant, I actually preferred relationships. I didn't like being single, but I actually preferred to be in relationships, and those relationships were still challenging in their own way. Now, when it comes to looking back on that and the moments when I wanted my own independence in the relationship, it's because I showed up in a certain way in the beginning that was inauthentic to myself. And this is why many people will perceive their need for independence so strongly when an avoidance starts to push back on things like wanting to spend less time together or needing their own alone time. It's because usually when they start up their relationships, they're getting to know someone, they put in a lot of effort. They try really hard and they put in a lot of consistent energy to try and foster a relationship with this person. And this leads the person to believe that this person is pretty secure. They're consistent, they show up and they make an effort, but it also creates a false precedence that they will show up like that 100% of the time. What ends up happening is avoidance will become burnt out. And they'll realize that they can't show up with that much intensity for such a long time because realistically, it is their sympathetic nervous system that is in the driver's seat, that is trying to tell them to show up in a very specific way to get this person to approve of you, to get this person to embrace you so that you can remind yourself that you are worthy and deserving of love. And when they realize that this person isn't going to fill that void, that's when they start to pull away and create a healthier balance in their mind for more independence in the relationship. And of course, for anyone else, this could be quite triggering, right? You suddenly have had this person show up really consistently with a lot of energy, and now they're seemingly putting in less effort. They're not texting as much. They're not calling you. They don't want to see you as much during the week. And when you ask to get back to that place, or you ask to maybe see them once a week and once on the weekend, they can become very dismissive. And so when a dismissive avoidant finds themselves in one of these relationships, reaching out and trying to gain their independence is a way that they're trying to regain control over the situation. What matters most for dismissive avoidance is if they want to change this, they have to be able to not look at themselves through a shameful lens, and they need to learn better strategies when it comes to emotional regulation, but also learn certain communication strategies to be able to share this with their partners so that they don't necessarily share them in hurtful ways that can be very invalidating and hurtful to the other person. Which leads me into the fourth reason why many dismissive avoidants often pull away in relationships, because they don't have experience with soaking up prime examples of how to emotionally regulate yourself or healthy ways to manage your emotions and talk about those emotions. The act of expressing your emotions can be very triggering for them. It can be one of the reasons why they pull away, because rather than trying to do the hard thing of adapt to a relationship that has increasingly emotionally intimate needs, it's often easier to pull away because expressing your emotions comes with a lot of baggage. For a lot of dismissive avoidants, they have a lot of innate shame. They have guilt for having emotions. And they've also been trained indirectly or nurtured to believe that by having emotions and communicating for them, that makes them a bad person. And so when you're in a relationship suddenly later in life where the other person is telling you that's a good thing, this directly challenges the belief systems you have about yourself and how you exist in your world. The very idea of yourself as a person and how you fit into the very world that you exist in can be very conflicted at this point when you've been growing up learning that sharing your emotions is bad, and now you're in a relationship where this person wants it. You have to directly confront those beliefs you have about shame and judgment and guilt that you've taken on as true about yourself, and you have to unpack all of that while trying to make the other person happy. But because you don't necessarily have the healthy tools and skills to communicate this to your other person, you will sometimes do this work internally and find that you're very conflicted. A lot of this work is done internally. They try to keep it on wraps because they themselves don't understand that having emotions isn't necessarily a bad thing. And out of the fear of being judged and shamed, they don't necessarily want to share this with other people. And this is why sometimes people will say that it's hard to often get a read on dismissive avoidance, how they feel, what they're thinking, and almost why sometimes they can be perceived as secretive. It's not that they're trying to hide things from you, it's just that they usually suffer from a deep core wound related with shame that they don't maybe feel comfortable sharing that with other people because they've had to adopt a hard exterior of always being the happy person or being the person that's always available for other people, that they don't have the capacity to be available for themselves. If you think about this like a muscle, when you grow up in an environment where a certain muscle is required very often, that muscle is going to be very strong and it's going to be agile. And when you need to use it, it's going to function properly. If you think about the dismissive avoidant in the context of their emotions as a muscle, they've grown up in a space where that muscle was not encouraged. It was not used, and therefore, over time, it became underdeveloped. And when you go on later in life and you're suddenly put in a situation where you have to use that muscle, you're going to find that it's not going to function very well. And so getting into the last reason why many dismissive avoidants will pull away is because of conflict. Now, many times the emotions in the relationship can be interlinked with conflict. And many times dismissive avoidants, they have a negative association with their emotions. They think that having emotions is bad. Having emotions and expressing them makes you a bad person. And when someone else shares emotions, it raises alarm bells for them and tells them that this is a stressful situation. You are a bad person because you couldn't make them happy. And in the past, when you made someone unhappy, it meant you were punished or you suffered in some way. And so as a means of self-protecting, avoidants will take on some very interesting coping mechanisms to deal with conflict when it comes up in their relationships. So there are two common ways that I've seen, both in personal life, but also working with dismissive avoidants, that they manage stress, especially one that is linked to conflict. So one of the first ways is to become hyper defensive. They become very shut down, and they become defensive to the point where they try to shut down the conversation, either by taking them out of that situation or conversation, or they become defensive to the point where they can become verbally abusive so that the other person doesn't feel like they have a leg to stand on in the conversation. And oftentimes it can be linked with their ego, but many times it can just be linked with the fact that their nervous system is screaming and they're just trying to do whatever they can to get control over the situation so that they can feel safe again. It's just their inner child that is desperately asking to be soothed. And their way of doing that is to dominate the situation by pushing the other person away. If they can push the other person away and the conflict will come to a conclusion, they can go back to feeling good again, even though it doesn't make anyone feel good at the end of the day. One of the more harmless ways that I often see dismissive avoidants try to manage conflict is to divert the conversation or to deflect the conversation. They may also minimize the conflict to try and make it seem less intimidating, but they may actually still talk to you about that conflict. And this is someone who I would say doesn't necessarily have a severe avoidant attachment style, but they may still have some deep core wounds that need to be addressed because they're not necessarily making space for the other person to have an emotional capacity in that relationship. And that's one particular reason why partners of dismissive avoidance can often walk away feeling invalidated and dismissed and ultimately unloved in those relationships. And lastly, I kind of talked a bit about this before, but one of the ways maybe less severe dismissive avoidance will manage conflict is by being a people pleaser. Rather than being explosive or having a fight, they can often be very apologetic. They can be overly apologetic and agree with you before you even had a chance to explain your side. Oftentimes, they can be the type to take on blame and then even shame themselves for not being good enough. They are just the type to agree with you, to make you happy, to appease you so that you don't constantly remind them in the form of conflict that they're a bad person, that they're unloved or they're unworthy or they're not good enough. And so they've learned as a strategy that if they make themselves smaller, if they get quiet, if they shut down and they agree with the other person will stop being angry with them. Now, you actually see this many times in people who can suffer from CPTSD. These are the types of people who will sometimes just make themselves smaller, especially if they grew up in really abusive households with abusive parents. They learned as a strategy that if they can make them small like a mouse, that they're going to be less likely to be hurt and judged and shamed as a result because they're not trying to fight back at the other person anymore. They're just going with the flow and agreeing with them and taking on those beliefs as their own so that the other person will stop having conflict with them. And this is one of the ways where they make themselves sometimes susceptible to more abuse. And it is really sad to see because they're just trying to do it out of self-protection. But sometimes these people can find themselves in relationships with narcissists. And because they are so willing to agree with other people, they are more likely to be susceptible to abuse. And really, this is just one example of how avoidant attachment can be different from person to person. So when you watch content about attachment styles, I personally believe that it is important to remember that no two people who share a common attachment style will be the exact same way in a relationship. It's essential to understand that you can't heal someone by loving them or supporting them or being in a relationship with them if they too are not doing the work themselves to heal their attachment style. However, with self-awareness, communication, and possibly therapy, people with insecure attachment styles can learn healthier ways to thrive in their relationships. I hope you received value from this video. If you did, drop a like down below. Additionally, if you're interested in working together one-on-one, you can look in the description and book a one-on-one session with me. If you want to learn more about attachment styles, then feel free to check out these videos. There's a lot of great information there for you. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and happy healing.